People versus Gonzalez.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. Cami Lizarraga from the Office of the Appellate Defender for Emilio Gonzalez. At Emilio's trial, the prosecution's case was based entirely on two teenagers whose accounts were full of contradictions and inconsistencies, as even the trial court below had to admit at sentencing. Yet, the jury's weighing of this evidence was irreparably tainted by the prosecutor's many improper comments in summation, which included a directive that to accept defense counsel's arguments would be to go against their oath as jurors. As a result of these comments, this court cannot have confidence in this verdict because the prosecutor's comments in summation skewed the jury's weighing of very flawed evidence.
Did you raise an objection to any of those comments?
Your Honor, the defense counsel here objected to some of the comments while they occurred, especially some of the worst ones in which the defense counsel shifted the burden of proof and denigrated.
I'll repeat my question.
Counsel.
Some or one?
Some, but not all. However, then he moved for a mistrial immediately following
That doesn't
summation.
preserve it.
Well, in this court held in Tolbert, Your Honor, that a mistrial motion did preserve a prosecutorial misconduct in summation argument. And in Collins, notably, this court reached the issue even when a mistrial motion was not made, where there was an obdurate pattern of misconduct. And here, the prosecutor shifted the burden of proof, denigrated the defense, name-called, misrepresented the evidence critical to proof of guilt, and drew conclusions not fairly inferable from the evidence, all of which are tactics that this court and the Court of Appeals has repeatedly held are not fair tactics and are not fair response to defense counsel's arguments. This was a virtual catalog of prosecutorial misconduct. Not only did the prosecutor say that to accept the defense would be to go against the jury's oath.
There was an objection to that statement, correct?
There was an objection to that statement.
Sustained.
It was sustained, Your Honor, but the jury...
There was no subsequent request for a curative.
Well, he subsequently moved for a mistrial, Your Honor, because the jury could not unhear that remark, especially when combined with other remarks shifting the burden of proof, such as disparaging defense counsel's proper argument about the inconsistencies in the evidence as shrouded in what-ifs, shrouded in wild imagination, which again improperly suggested to the jury that the defense had a burden to bring forward evidence to support its arguments instead of poking holes in the prosecutor's case and arguing the inconsistencies. In addition, the prosecutor argued, again shifting the burden of proof, if Amber Brea, one of the main witnesses in this case, was going to lie, why not go for it? Why not make it better? We know why she was here, jurors. This was her friend. If she was going to get up there and lie, why not go for it? This was rhetoric that closely mirrored the prosecutor's statements in Collins, in which the prosecutor said, if he was going to lie, why not make it rock solid? Which this court held shifts the burden of proof to the defense. And that was not all. The prosecutor also denigrated the defense by saying he was trying to pull on the jurors' sympathy by correctly noting the participants' ages here, which were between the ages of 11 and 17. In addition, the prosecutor name-called the defendant, calling him a coward and a killer, in remarks that the respondent does not try to defend, where this court in Collins has held name-calling is never appropriate in summation. In addition, the prosecutor misrepresented what was the critical evidence in this case, which were the two witnesses' testimony on the actual stabbing. And here those two witnesses gave two different accounts. Amber says the stabbing happens in front of the building where the party was, and then Emilio runs up and stabs Damien while he's distracted fighting. Jeffrey Reyes says, no, that didn't actually happen. Damien was running down the street and Emilio ran after him. So those were two different accounts of the stabbing, which is a key flaw. Yet the prosecutor, in summation, instead of grappling with those inconsistent accounts, said they gave the same account. That was page 530 of the transcript, which was especially insidious in this case, where the jurors might think we're misremembering the contradictions in the evidence. There's a reason why the prosecutor is not allowed to misrepresent evidence. It's because of the authority that the prosecutor's office holds and the deference that the jury gives to the prosecutor. And by misrepresenting the central evidence, the prosecutor papered over what was a key flaw in this evidence and did not allow the jury to appropriately weigh it. This was not a harmless error in this case, where it completely hinged on two witnesses who described two very different versions of the stabbing. There was no other evidence of Emilio's guilt in this case. None of the other 25 to 30 teenagers present for this stabbing were testified. Many of them were not even questioned by the police. The two officers who testified at this trial never even went to the scene. So there was no evidence outside from these two teenagers' accounts, which were contradictory, internally inconsistent, and bore grave credibility issues, as a result of which this court cannot have confidence in this verdict.
Good afternoon, Cynthia Carlson for the Office of Darcel D. Clark. The defendant's conviction for the intentional murder of Damien Martinez was established by overwhelming evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. Although defendant now tries to attack his conviction using arguments that are largely unpreserved, all are meritless. The two witnesses that testified at trial here testified fundamentally to the same things.
Well, you have to sort of concede that some of the remarks by the assistant district attorney may have been better left unsaid.
Absolutely, Your Honor. That is correct. However,
Maybe you should give a little CLE to the trial lawyers.
I will be sure to tell my boss that we need a CLE on prosecutorial misconduct in the summation. There are times where she was responding to the defense counsel's arguments. Her summation cannot be viewed in a vacuum. And so when she's referring to why Amber would lie, that is in direct response to defense counsel's arguments 30 separate times that these were lying witnesses who lie. She was inartful in some of her arguments, but ultimately the overwhelming evidence of the defendant's guilt in this case goes to show that whatever her comments were in summation were not pervasive and certainly didn't rise to the level that it would deprive the defendant of a fair trial. And those facts that are important that the two witnesses agreed upon are that the defendant armed himself with a bottle, the defendant armed himself with a knife, the defendant and the victim had a beef amongst each other, and that the defendant hit the victim in the head with a bottle when the victim was distracted, and then when the victim was again distracted, stabbed him with such force that he was able to penetrate the victim's heart with a knife that had a blade in excess of 5 inches. The facts of this case are reprehensible, and it is why the judge at sentencing, Judge Alvarado, specifically tailored, as he noted, he specifically tailored his 20-year sentence for this defendant because of the facts of this case, and it had taken into consideration the defendant's youth. And for this reason, the people would rest on our brief and request that this court uphold his conviction.
Thank you.
Your Honor, the summation here was not fair response to defense counsel's arguments. Certainly, defense counsel strenuously challenged the credibility of these witnesses, and at most, the prosecutor, in response, was allowed to try and rehabilitate their credibility by pointing to facts in the record that were consistent with their accounts. But that did not in any way entitle the prosecutor to do what she did here, which was to shift the burden of proof, denigrate the defense, and name-call. Many of those remarks are uncontested by respondent in their brief. It did not entitle the prosecutor here to use any of those tactics in response to defense counsel's summation. And in fact, the respondent does not point to any cases holding those tactics were warranted. And whereas here, the jury heard two teenagers, one of whom had been himself, confessed to assaulting Damien as he lay dying, who had an incentive to shift the blame. On the other hand, you have Amber with her inconsistencies throughout her testimony, her admissions to misleading the grand jury, her inexplicable 2-day delay in reporting this to the police, despite Damien supposedly being her close friend. When you have her statement that after Damien got stabbed, he starts running and she says, "Damien, you running?" He says, "I got stabbed." And she says, "That's when I put everything together." When you have the circumstances surrounding the stabbing that suggest that perhaps she didn't see it. It was dark outside. It was 1:15 in the morning. She said this was a riot. She testified that Damien was fighting, that she was fighting, that there were people fighting between them. And then you have those two witnesses giving fundamentally contradictory accounts with no other evidence of guilt. The prosecutor's comments saying to accept his arguments would be to go against your oath, that defense counsel's appropriate challenges to the evidence as inconsistent was wild imagination and wild speculation and what ifs, that could not be harmless, and this court cannot have confidence in this verdict. So we ask that this court reverse.
Thank you. Thank you both. People versus Robbins.